Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our story. The soft sound of the rain tapping against the windows echoed through the quiet, nearly empty street as Mark Davis trudged along the sidewalk, his worn-out shoes barely making a sound on the wet pavement. His shoulders were slumped with the weight of the world on them. At 23, Mark had already experienced more than most of his peers. As a law student juggling part-time jobs, he was struggling to keep his head above water after his father's sudden death left him with a mountain of debt. Today was another one of those days where everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He glanced down at his phone, its screen cracked from too many falls, and saw the missed calls, the messages he couldn't respond to. He had to focus on his future, yet all he could think about was the pile of bills he could not pay, the rent that was overdue, and the heavy burden of responsibility he carried for his mother's mounting medical expenses. Mark had a plan, but he was losing hope every day. That was when the call came. It wasn't the kind of call he was used to. It was from a woman he didn't know, Eleanor Brooks, a name that immediately caught his attention. Eleanor Brooks, the CEO of Brooks Enterprises. He stared at the screen for a moment, unsure whether he should even pick up. But something in his gut told him this wasn't just another scam. Taking a deep breath, he answered. "Mr. Davis," a calm, authoritative voice said, "I would like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." Mark frowned, confused. "I'm sorry, who is this?" he asked. "How do you know about that?" Her voice was steady, unfazed. "I know enough. Let's meet at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." Before he could protest, the line went dead. Mark stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed against his ear. He had no idea what this was about, but something told him he needed to go. When he arrived at the bistro later that evening, the rain had picked up, drenching the streets in a cold mist. The warm glow from inside the restaurant felt like a beacon in the storm. Mark pushed open the door and stepped inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and fine wine filling the air. He could feel the eyes of a few patrons glance up as he walked in, the discomfort of being underdressed hitting him immediately. He didn't belong here, but he had no choice. There, at a corner table, sat Eleanor Brooks. She was older, in her early 50s, but there was something commanding about her presence. She sat with the poise of someone who had everything under control, her sharp blue eyes scanning a tablet in front of her. Mark hesitated for a moment before making his way over to her table. "Mr. Davis," she said, without looking up, as he reached the table. "Please, sit down." Mark sat down, still unsure of what to make of this meeting. He adjusted his jacket, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "I'm sure you're wondering why I've asked to meet with you," she said, finally looking up at him. "You've been struggling to stay afloat. Your debts are considerable, and your future is uncertain. I'm here to offer you a solution." Mark blinked, his heart racing. "A solution? What kind of solution?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes focused on him. "A business arrangement. I can help you pay off your debts. I can ensure your financial stability. In return, you will marry me." Mark's mind went blank. "Marry you?" he asked, his voice betraying the shock he felt. "But why me? We don't even know each other." Eleanor's lips curled into a small, measured smile. "You're young. You're struggling. You have no family left to support you, and I have no one to share my life with. This is a business arrangement, Mr. Davis. Nothing more. You'll be my husband, and in exchange, I'll secure your future." Mark sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had no idea how to respond to this. The weight of his situation hung over him, the thought of being able to pay off his debts, to give his mother the care she needed, but at what cost? Was this really the only option? I know this is a lot to take in, Eleanor continued, sensing his hesitation. Take your time, but understand that the offer won't be on the table forever. Mark felt his pulse quicken as he weighed the offer in his mind. Was it desperation or just practicality that led him to agree? Or maybe it was something deeper. Something inside him told him he had no choice but to consider it. He nodded slowly, his thoughts still swirling. I'll think about it, Mark finally said, his voice low. Eleanor simply nodded, her expression unreadable. As Mark left the bistro that night, the rain still falling heavily around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he wasn't ready for. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. The question was, what would happen next? The rain had stopped by the time Mark left Brooks' bistro, but the weight of Eleanor's proposal still hung heavy in the air. He walked back through the streets, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The world felt colder than usual, and every drop of rain that hit the pavement seemed to echo in his mind. He didn't know what to make of the offer, but something about it felt different. It was a lifeline. But it was also a chain. He couldn't stop thinking about his mother, her medical bills piling up, and the looming threat of eviction. What other choice did he have? As Mark arrived back at his cramped apartment, the familiar scent of old furniture and takeout containers greeted him. His place wasn't much, but it was home. Or at least, it had been. He dropped his backpack by the door and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the cracked ceiling. The glow of the streetlights outside filtered in through the window, casting long shadows across the room. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from his mother, a simple one, "Love you, son." A pang of guilt hit him in the chest. He hadn't told her about the meeting with Eleanor. He hadn't even told her how bad things had gotten. How could he? She was already struggling with her own health, and he couldn't bear to add more worry to her plate. But now, faced with the reality of his mounting debts, the weight of it all felt unbearable. Mark sat up, running his fingers through his hair. He knew what he had to do. Eleanor's offer wasn't just a lifeline for him, it could be the solution his mother needed. But how could he marry someone he didn't know? How could he live with someone so powerful, so different from him? The thought of it made his stomach churn. Yet, there was a part of him that knew this might be the only chance he had to fix everything. He stared at his phone, the screen flickering in the dim light. He could already hear his mother's voice in his head, urging him to think carefully. But the truth was, he was running out of options. He had been trying to find a way out of this mess for months. Every door he opened led to another dead end. With a sigh, Mark picked up the phone and called Eleanor back. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Mr. Davis," Eleanor's voice was calm, but there was a note of curiosity in it. "Have you had time to think about my proposal?" Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Yes, I've thought about it. And I'm willing to go ahead with the arrangement." Eleanor was silent for a moment, as if processing his decision. Then she spoke again, her tone softened but still firm. "I understand this is a difficult decision. But I assure you, this will benefit both of us. You'll be able to take care of your debts, and I will have a companion, someone to share my life with, even if it's only on paper. This will be a professional relationship, Mr. Davis. Nothing more." Mark nodded, though she couldn't see him. He had already made up his mind. "I understand." "Good," Eleanor said. "We'll meet tomorrow morning to sign the contract. I'll have my lawyer prepare everything. I'll arrange for a car to pick you up at 9 a.m. sharp." Mark didn't have the words to say anything more. He simply nodded again before ending the call. He sank back into the couch, feeling the weight of the decision settle on him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just a contract. It was his future, his mother's future. He could only hope that in the end, it would all be worth it. The next morning, Mark was up early, too early for a man who had barely gotten any sleep. He threw on his best suit, one that had seen better days, with frayed cuffs and a collar that was just a little too tight. But it was all he had. He ran his fingers through his hair, taking a deep breath before leaving the apartment. As he walked to the door, he glanced back at the empty room. It felt like he was saying goodbye to the life he once knew. When the car arrived, a sleek black sedan, Mark slid into the back seat. The driver barely acknowledged him as he started the engine and pulled out into the street. The silence in the car was deafening, and Mark couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. Eleanor Brooks was a woman he knew nothing about, yet here he was, about to marry her. The car ride felt like it lasted a lifetime. Mark stared out the window, watching the world go by, lost in his thoughts. He thought about the life he could have had if things had turned out differently. He thought about the life his mother deserved, and the chance to give her that life. Eleanor's proposal wasn't just a way out for him, it was a way to fix everything. As the car pulled up to a grand, imposing mansion, Mark's heart skipped a beat. This was the world Eleanor lived in. He had never been in a place like this, never imagined he would be. The mansion's towering columns and sprawling grounds seemed to mock him in their perfection. He felt like an outsider, someone who didn't belong. But this was his chance. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. As the driver opened the door for him, Mark stepped out and looked up at the house. It was beautiful, intimidating, even, but he had no choice. He had to walk through that door, into this new world, whether he was ready or not. Mark took a deep breath and walked up the steps, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the grand hall. Eleanor was waiting inside, just as composed as ever, her piercing blue eyes scanning him as he entered. There was no turning back now. Mark stepped through the massive doors of Eleanor's mansion, feeling like a fish out of water. The marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and the walls were adorned with expensive paintings and sculptures. Everything about this place screamed wealth and power. Eleanor, standing at the top of the grand staircase, watched him with an air of quiet confidence. She was impeccable as always, her tailored suit, her perfectly styled hair, her expression unreadable. Mark felt small in comparison, but he reminded himself that he had no choice. This was his chance. "Mr. Davis," Eleanor said as he reached the base of the stairs, her voice calm but with an edge of formality. "Welcome. I trust the ride was comfortable?" Mark nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, thank you." She gestured for him to follow her, and Mark walked behind her through the large hallway. The silence was thick, and his thoughts raced. This was the moment he had been preparing for, though he couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. Every step felt like a step further away from the life he knew, and yet, closer to something that could change everything. They entered a lavishly decorated living room, where a tall, imposing man stood waiting. Eleanor's lawyer, no doubt. He was already holding a file in his hands, a neutral expression on his face. Mark's stomach churned at the sight of the legal documents. Everything about this felt surreal, like he was walking through someone else's life. Eleanor turned to him. "We'll go over the contract, Mr. Davis. It's all straightforward. No surprises." Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm ready." As Eleanor's lawyer laid out the paperwork, Mark couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The terms were clear: a contract marriage for a set period of time. He would live in the mansion, maintain a professional relationship with Eleanor, and in return, his debts would be erased. It wasn't a romantic arrangement, it was a business deal. But the more he read, the more he realized how much he was giving up. He wasn't just signing away his freedom. He was signing away his future, his autonomy. "This is just a formality," Eleanor said, interrupting his thoughts. She leaned against the back of a chair, watching him closely. "I'm not asking for anything beyond what's written here. It's a simple arrangement. You fulfill your part, and I'll fulfill mine." Mark glanced up at her, her eyes piercing him as if she were waiting for him to question something. But he couldn't. He was too far in. I understand, he said quietly, signing his name at the bottom of the page. Eleanor's lawyer nodded, gathering the documents. Eleanor stepped forward, holding out her hand. "Welcome to the family, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice carrying an unspoken weight. Mark hesitated before shaking her hand, the formality of it all settling heavily on his chest. As the lawyer left the room, Eleanor motioned to a nearby table, where a bottle of wine sat with 2 glasses. She poured them both a drink, handing Mark one before sitting across from him. Her gaze softened just slightly as she took a sip of her wine. "Now that it's official, we can talk," she said, her tone a little less cold. "I'm not expecting anything from you except what's written in the contract, but I think it's important to understand each other." Mark took a deep breath, his mind still reeling from the shock of what he'd just done. "So, what now?" he asked. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, considering him for a moment. "Now, we start living our lives. We go to events, we make appearances, we go about our days. You'll have a comfortable life here, with no more worries about your finances." She paused. "But remember, this is still a business arrangement. If you think you can back out at any time, you're mistaken." Mark nodded. He had expected her to be blunt, but something about her words stung. "I understand." "Good," Eleanor said, standing up. "Now, I'll show you to your room. You'll have your own space, of course, but I'll expect you to join me for dinner later. There's a gala tonight, and it's important that we make an appearance." Mark followed her up the staircase, the weight of everything settling on his shoulders. He didn't know what to expect from this arrangement, but as he glanced at Eleanor, he knew that his life had changed forever. This was no longer just a way out of debt, it was a whole new world, one where everything was different, and where the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. As he entered the room she had prepared for him, Mark felt a mix of awe and apprehension. The room was luxurious, with a large bed, a private bathroom, and a breathtaking view of the sprawling estate. He walked to the window, looking out at the meticulously manicured gardens below. But even in the midst of such beauty, there was a heaviness in his chest. This was his new life, whether he was ready for it or not. He turned away from the window, sitting on the edge of the bed. He wasn't sure what had come over him in that moment, but he realized he wasn't just trapped by debt anymore. He was trapped in something much bigger. And the question that kept running through his mind was simple: would he ever be able to escape? The sound of a distant clock chimed, marking the passing of time. Mark took a deep breath, knowing that he was about to enter a world he might never truly understand. He could only hope that, somehow, he would find his way through it. The evening arrived faster than Mark expected. After a brief rest in the opulent room Eleanor had prepared for him, he dressed carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted his collar. He still wasn't entirely sure what to make of the day, but Eleanor had made it clear tonight's gala was important. He couldn't back out now. The car would be waiting for him at 7 p.m, ready to take him to yet another world he never thought he'd step into. When Mark arrived at the venue, a grand ballroom lit by crystal chandeliers and filled with the soft hum of polite conversation, he felt the full weight of his new life. He was surrounded by the city's elite billionaires, CEOs, and socialites whose lives seemed as polished and perfect as the gold-plated walls. His stomach churned as he realized how out of place he felt. No one knew his name here, no one knew his struggles, and it seemed they didn't care. At the entrance, Eleanor was waiting for him, looking every bit the part of a businesswoman with a cold, calculating mind. She wore a sleek black gown that shimmered under the lights, her hair pinned perfectly back. She looked like she belonged in this world, like she ruled it. Mark felt his heart race as he approached her. "You're here," Eleanor said with a small, approving smile as she scanned him from head to toe. "You clean up well." Her eyes softened just a fraction, but there was no warmth in them, only a polite, detached observation. Mark nodded, trying to force a smile. "Thanks. You look stunning." Eleanor led him into the heart of the gala, and Mark followed, trying to keep his nerves in check. He noticed that she was already well known in this circle, greeting everyone with the same polite yet distant manner. No one seemed to question their partnership, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They were, after all, the perfect power couple, even if it was all just a front. "Do your best to blend in," Eleanor whispered as they walked through the crowd. "We're here to make an impression, not to make friends." Mark nodded, absorbing her words. The idea of blending in was harder than he thought. How could someone like him, a man who had spent his entire life struggling, pretend to belong in a world of such opulence? The more he watched the guests, the more alien it all felt. But then, just as he was starting to withdraw into himself, Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely audible over the music. "You're doing fine. Just stay close, and don't forget what this is about." Mark forced himself to focus. The evening dragged on, with polite small talk and endless glasses of champagne. He felt out of place, but he kept reminding himself why he was here. Eleanor had given him a way out of his problems, a chance to rebuild his life. All he had to do was endure the pretending, the smile he had to wear like a mask. Around 9:00 p.m., the announcement came. Eleanor was called to the stage to receive an award. Mark stood off to the side, watching her glide across the room with the poise of someone who owned the space she occupied. She accepted the award with a gracious smile, her speech perfect, and the audience applauded her like they were all part of the same, well-rehearsed performance. When the applause died down, Eleanor's gaze swept over the crowd, and her eyes met Mark's for a brief moment. There was something in her expression, something subtle that Mark couldn't quite place. It wasn't approval. It wasn't affection. It was acknowledgement, something far colder and far more calculating. After the ceremony, they returned to the table, and Eleanor handed Mark a glass of champagne, her demeanor still impeccable. "Good job tonight," she said, her voice as cold as ever. "You did what you were supposed to do." Mark took the glass from her, but he didn't drink. His mind was elsewhere, processing everything that had happened. He could feel the distance between them, the cold professionalism that defined their relationship. He had been hired, in a sense, to fill a role. But somewhere deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a part he would never truly understand. The night passed slowly, and by the time the gala began to wind down, Mark felt emotionally drained. He had endured the endless conversations, the laughter that seemed so fake, and the glances that were as empty as the champagne glasses they clinked together. Eleanor, ever the professional, was already deep in conversation with a group of influential men. Mark felt himself slipping back into the background, just as he had always been, invisible and unnoticed. As they left the venue and entered the waiting car, Eleanor glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice cool. "But don't forget your place." Mark looked out the window, watching the city lights blur by. He had signed up for this, but what was he really getting himself into? Was this life, this cold, calculated existence, what he truly wanted? He wasn't sure anymore. But one thing was certain: Eleanor had given him a chance. A chance to change everything. He could only hope that, somehow, he would find a way to make it his own. The days that followed the gala were a blur of meetings, events, and uncomfortable silences. Mark woke up each morning in the luxury of the mansion, but it felt like a prison more than a home. Eleanor was still the same cold, calculating woman he had met, always busy with work, never once treating him like anything more than a business partner. They rarely spoke outside of the formalities. Mark spent his days either attending events with her or sitting in his room, trying to shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life. It was on one of those quiet mornings that Eleanor asked him to join her for breakfast. The dining room was pristine, with a long, elegant table set for just the two of them. Mark sat across from her, trying to ignore the discomfort that filled the space between them. Eleanor looked more relaxed than usual, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her usual air of authority softened. "I need to talk to you," Eleanor said as she poured herself coffee. "About the next step." Mark's stomach twisted. He didn't know what she meant by next step, but he had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be anything good. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. She placed the coffee pot back on the table, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "You've been living here for a month now, Mark. It's time to start making your role in this partnership more meaningful." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Meaningful? He was still unsure of what exactly he was supposed to be doing. He was playing the role of a husband in name only, his days filled with events that made him feel even more like a puppet on strings. I thought we had a clear agreement. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her tone sharp, yet measured. We do, but in order to make this arrangement more convincing, I need you to step up. There are several public events coming up, and I expect you to be more involved. People need to believe in our marriage, Mark. They need to see us as a team. Mark's chest tightened. The more Eleanor spoke, the more he felt like he was being trapped in a game he didn't know how to play. I'm just supposed to pretend, he asked, his voice betraying his frustration. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. It's not about pretending. It's about presenting a united front. People will see us as a power couple, not just as two strangers with a contract. She paused, her gaze softening for the briefest moment. You're not the only one in this arrangement, Mark. I'm putting a lot on the line too. It's not just about you anymore. It's about both of us. Mark sat back in his chair, trying to process what she was saying. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This was no longer just a way out of debt, it was a carefully calculated strategy for Eleanor's business, and he was just a piece on her chessboard. He had never felt more powerless. He didn't respond at first, unsure of what to say. He was still caught in the whirlwind of the past few weeks, trying to keep up with the demands of their partnership, and it was wearing him thin. The weight of it all felt like it was suffocating him. Eleanor, seemingly reading his silence, added, I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Mark. I don't need that from you. All I'm asking is that you be present. Be supportive. Show up when it matters. Mark nodded slowly, his mind racing. Was he really just supposed to accept this? Was this the life he was now tied to? A life of obligation and cold calculation? I'll do what I can, he said finally, his voice low. But you have to understand I am not used to this. I've never been a part of a world like this. And I don't know how much longer I can pretend it's okay. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp and calculating. Then she nodded, as if satisfied with his answer. Good, she said simply, standing up from the table. We have an event tonight. I expect you to be there and to do exactly as I've asked. Mark didn't respond, watching as she walked out of the room with the same composed, confident stride she always had. As the door closed behind her, Mark let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything settle on him once again. He had agreed to this. He had agreed to play a role in Eleanor's world, but as the days passed, it was becoming harder to remember who he was supposed to be anymore. That night, as he stood beside Eleanor at yet another gala, smiling and shaking hands with people he didn't know, Mark realized something. The life he had once known, the life of struggle and hardship, seemed like a distant memory. This new life, with all its glamour and luxury, was suffocating him in ways he hadn't expected. Eleanor had given him a way out of his debts, but at what cost? Was it worth it? And more importantly, would he ever find a way to break free from this contract, or had he already sold his soul? As the evening wore on, Mark found himself drifting further from Eleanor's side, feeling more and more like an outsider in a world that wasn't his own. He had no answers. Just questions. And in the back of his mind, he knew that the longer he stayed, the harder it would be to leave. The following weeks passed in a blur of public appearances, lavish dinners, and endless events that Mark had to endure. Every day felt like he was living someone else's life. Eleanor, always the composed and calculating woman, had made it clear that this was no longer just about the contract. It was about maintaining an image, creating a narrative that everyone would believe. She had a reputation to uphold, and Mark was now a part of that. But the more time he spent in her world, the more he felt like an outsider, a stranger trapped in a golden cage. One morning, after yet another sleepless night of endless thoughts, Mark woke up to find a message from Eleanor. It was brief, as usual. Meet me at the office at 10 o'clock a.m. We need to discuss something important. No explanation, just the order. It was becoming a pattern. She would give him just enough information to make him follow through but never let him fully in on the details. Mark glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:30 a.m. He had half an hour to get dressed and ready. His body felt heavy from the weight of the situation, but he pushed himself to move. It wasn't like he had much of a choice. He pulled on his suit and made his way to the car waiting outside, the driver barely acknowledging him as he got in. The ride to Eleanor's office was short but long enough for Mark to think about what this all meant. Was he really just a tool for Eleanor, another asset in her carefully constructed empire? Or was there something more? When he arrived at the office, Eleanor was already there, seated behind a large, polished desk. She looked up as Mark entered, her sharp eyes scanning him briefly before she gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Mark," she said, her voice as cool as ever. "We need to discuss the next steps for our partnership." Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He didn't know what this meeting was about, but he knew Eleanor always had a reason for everything. Nothing was ever just casual with her. She pushed a file toward him. "We've been getting a lot of attention lately, and it's time to make sure we're seen as a power couple. I've scheduled a press conference next week. I expect you to be fully involved. We're going to make this relationship look as legitimate as possible. The public needs to believe in us." Mark blinked, his heart sinking. "A press conference?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "You want us to do a public appearance like that? Pretend like everything is real?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "That's exactly what I want. It's not about pretending, Mark. It's about presenting the right image. We've played our part so far, but this is the final step. If we pull this off, we'll secure everything we've worked for. The press, the media, they'll buy into it." Mark leaned back in his chair, processing what she was saying. This was real. This wasn't just about his debts anymore, it was about something much bigger. He had been so focused on the escape she promised him that he hadn't realized how deeply involved he was becoming in her world. He had no idea how to act in front of the cameras, how to convince an audience that their marriage was something other than a contract. And deep down, he feared that he might actually have to live the lie. "You're not backing out, are you?" Eleanor's voice interrupted his thoughts, sharp as ever. Mark looked at her, his face blank. "No," he said quietly, his mind still racing. "I'm not backing out." Eleanor gave a small nod of approval. "Good. The press conference is in 3 days. Make sure you're ready. This is your chance to prove yourself. I'll have my team brief you on everything you need to know. And don't forget, you're not just playing a role, you're proving your commitment to this. Our success depends on how convincing we are. You need to be believable." Mark couldn't deny the weight of her words. He had been living this lie for weeks, but now it was becoming too real. He was about to stand in front of the world and pretend he was in a marriage built on love and mutual respect when in reality, it was just a contract. He had agreed to this, but the deeper he went, the harder it was to separate the person he was from the role he had to play. "I'll do my best," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor smiled, her eyes gleaming with a mix of satisfaction and something else, something he couldn't quite place. "That's all I need to hear." As Mark left her office, his mind was spinning. A press conference. His heart raced as he imagined the cameras, the flashing lights, the questions. Could he really go through with it? Was he really going to pretend to be in love with a woman he barely knew, for the sake of a contract? He was trapped. He had no way out, no way to escape from the life he had chosen. The ride back to the mansion felt like it took forever. Mark stared out the window, lost in thought. He could feel the walls closing in around him, and he wondered how long it would take before he lost himself completely in the role he was playing. The life he had before this felt like a distant memory, a dream he might never wake up from. The press conference was looming, and with it, his future. But as Mark stared at his reflection in the car window, he wondered, was this really the life he wanted? Or had he already sacrificed too much of himself to turn back now? The day of the press conference arrived faster than Mark anticipated. He had spent the past 2 days practicing his lines, rehearsing the perfect smile, trying to imagine himself in a life that wasn't his. Every time he closed his eyes, the weight of the situation hit him harder. He had come so far, but now, standing at the threshold of the press event, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of losing himself. Mark sat in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. The suit he wore fit perfectly, tailored to his frame, but it felt more like a costume than clothing. He wasn't the man he had been a few months ago. He had gone from struggling student to a man playing the part of a husband in a business arrangement. And today, he was about to sell that image to the world. The limo that had picked him up was parked outside, waiting to take him to the event. The driver, a faceless figure, gave him a polite nod when he climbed in. The ride to the venue was quiet, with the sounds of the city muffled by the tinted windows. Mark stared out the window, lost in thought. The noise of the world outside seemed distant, as though he were no longer a part of it. His thoughts were a jumble of doubt, fear, and the undeniable truth that he had no way of turning back. When they arrived at the venue, a lavish hotel ballroom set up for the press conference, Mark was immediately surrounded by reporters, cameras, and the flash of lights. Eleanor, as always, was calm and composed, standing at the front, ready to take her place in the spotlight. She greeted the reporters with a practiced smile, answering questions with ease, as if she had done this 1,000 times. Mark, standing beside her, felt small in comparison. He had never been in a situation like this, never imagined he would be standing here, playing a part that wasn't his. As the conference began, Eleanor introduced Mark as her husband, and the room buzzed with excitement. Mark could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the sharp questions coming at him from all directions. "How did you two meet?" one reporter asked. "What's it like, being married to such a powerful woman?" another inquired. Mark smiled, the kind of smile that felt more like a mask than an expression. He answered the questions with the rehearsed responses Eleanor had given him, saying the right things, pretending to be the man she wanted the world to see. As the event went on, Mark found himself sinking deeper into the role he had been given. The questions became more personal, more invasive, but he answered them all. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. The man in front of the cameras wasn't him. He was a reflection, a projection of the life Eleanor wanted to sell to the world. He was playing a part, and the worst part was, he wasn't sure how much of it was real anymore. When the conference finally ended, Eleanor gave him a subtle nod of approval. "Well done," she said, her voice cool and distant, just as it always was. "You did exactly what was needed. We've made our statement." Mark felt the weight of her words. "Yeah, I guess we did," he replied quietly. As they left the ballroom, Mark couldn't shake the emptiness that lingered in his chest. The press conference had been a success, but at what cost? He had done what Eleanor asked, played the role he was assigned, but inside, he felt hollow. The contract, the public appearances, the carefully constructed image was all starting to blur together. Was he ever going to find a way out of this life, or had he already given away too much of himself to turn back? The days following the press conference felt like a blur for Mark. He had played his part, stood in front of the cameras, and smiled for the world to see. But behind the scenes, things weren't as smooth as they appeared. Eleanor was still the same distant, calculating, always moving forward with her agenda. Mark, on the other hand, was beginning to question everything. The life he had agreed to live, the role he was playing, it was all starting to feel like it was swallowing him whole. As he sat in the mansion one evening, staring out the large windows that overlooked the perfectly manicured gardens, Mark couldn't help but feel more like a prisoner than ever. Every day, he put on the suit, he smiled at the cameras, and he pretended that everything was fine. But in those quiet moments, when no one was around, he wondered what had happened to the man he used to be. He had signed a contract. He had agreed to this arrangement for the sake of his debts, his family. But now, weeks later, it was becoming harder to separate the reality from the performance. Eleanor had given him everything: money, a place to stay, a chance to rebuild his life, but at what cost? He was losing himself in this fake marriage, in this world that didn't feel like his own. One evening, after another exhausting day of attending events and pretending to be part of Eleanor's world, Mark found himself alone in the library. He picked up a book, but he couldn't concentrate. His thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation they had a few days ago. Eleanor had told him to stay involved, to show up and support her, to be a convincing husband in front of the public. But as the days passed, he felt more and more detached from her and from the role he was supposed to be playing. The door creaked open, and Eleanor stepped into the room, as poised and composed as ever. She had a file in her hands, and when she saw Mark sitting by himself, she gave him a small, almost unreadable smile. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, her voice as cool and measured as always. "I have a few things I need to discuss with you. It's about the next step." Mark looked up at her, feeling a familiar unease settle in his stomach. "Next step?" he asked, his voice wary. Eleanor didn't sit down. Instead, she remained standing, the file still in her hands. "Yes. We've reached a point where I need you to make a bigger commitment. The public is buying into our story, but I need to make sure you're fully on board with this. The press loves a good narrative, Mark. But we need to take it a step further." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I need you to be more involved in my business, in my public life. People need to see that we are a true partnership, that you are committed not just to me, but to the future we are building together." Mark felt the walls closing in. "More involved?" he echoed. He didn't know if he could keep up with the performance anymore. The lines between what was real and what was fabricated were blurring, and he didn't know how much longer he could pretend. Eleanor's eyes softened just slightly. "I'm not asking for love, Mark. You've already done your part. But I need to know you're with me. We're building something here. Something big. And I need you to be fully invested, not just in the image, but in the future of what we're creating." He looked at her, her words sinking into him. He had always known this was about more than just a marriage contract, but now it felt like it was about his entire future, his identity, his sense of self. Could he really go along with this? Could he continue to live a lie, day after day, for the sake of a future that was never his to begin with? He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I'm with you," he said quietly, though a part of him wasn't sure who he was anymore. Eleanor gave him a small, approving nod. "Good," she said, "that's all I need to hear. The next few weeks will be crucial. We'll take this to the next level. I'll have my team brief you on the details. Don't disappoint me." As she turned to leave, Mark sat there in the library, the weight of her words still heavy on his chest. He had agreed to this again. He had agreed to give up a part of himself for this future. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing more than he had ever bargained for. As the days passed, Mark felt himself becoming more and more entrenched in the life Eleanor had created for them. He attended more events, smiled for more cameras, and played his part as the perfect husband in front of the world. But behind closed doors, the weight of the situation continued to press on him. The longer he stayed in this arrangement, the harder it became to remember who he was or where he had come from. One evening, after another long day of pretending, Mark sat alone in his room, staring out the window at the lights of the city below. The world seemed so distant, so removed from the life he once knew. He thought about his mother, the debts he had struggled to pay off, the hope he had once had of building a better future. Now, that future seemed like a distant memory, buried beneath the weight of his new life. The door to his room creaked open, and Eleanor stepped inside, her presence as commanding as always. She didn't wait for an invitation. Instead, she walked over to the chair by the window and took a seat, her gaze never leaving him. "You've been distant lately," Eleanor said, her voice cold but not without a trace of curiosity. "I thought we were past the point of pretending." Mark didn't answer immediately. He didn't know what to say. He had been living this lie for so long that it was starting to feel like the only reality he knew. But there was a part of him that wanted to break free, that wanted to find a way out before it was too late. "I'm not pretending," Mark finally said, his voice quiet, but firm. I'm not sure I can do this anymore. I don't know who I am in this world, Eleanor. I've lost myself." For the first time in their arrangement, Eleanor's expression shifted. It was subtle, but Mark saw a crack in the armor, a moment of vulnerability. She wasn't the cold, calculating woman she always appeared to be. In that brief moment, he saw someone else, someone who, like him, might be questioning the path they were on. "You don't have to be anyone you're not," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You've done everything I've asked of you. You've played the part perfectly." She paused, as if considering something. "But if you're truly unhappy, maybe it's time to reassess things. Maybe we're both trapped in this, and maybe we need to find a way to make it work on our own terms." Mark looked at her, surprised by the shift in her tone. For the first time since they had started this arrangement, he felt like they were speaking the same language. Maybe they had both been pretending for so long that they had forgotten who they were beneath the surface. The thought of ending this, of finding a way out, seemed almost impossible. But something in him, something deep down, knew that he couldn't keep living this lie. "Maybe you're right," Mark said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Maybe we need to figure this out for ourselves. I can't keep pretending, Eleanor. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." There was a long silence between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Finally, Eleanor stood up and walked to the door, pausing before she left. She turned to look at him, her gaze intense but thoughtful. "I won't force you to stay in this if it's not what you want," she said. "But I need you to understand something, Mark. You can't just walk away from everything. There are consequences, for both of us." Mark nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The decision he was about to make would change everything. He didn't know what the future held, or if he could even walk away from the life Eleanor had built for them. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a choice. As Eleanor left the room, Mark sat there, alone with his thoughts. The decision loomed large in his mind, and he knew that whatever path he chose, his life would never be the same. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to be true to himself again.